Good evening and welcome to the channel. What you are about to hear tonight is the moment that every defense analyst, every NATO official, and every world leader has been dreading since this war began 5 days ago. The moment when this conflict stops being a fight between the United States, Israel, and Iran and becomes something fundamentally and dangerously different. Tonight, that moment has arrived. France has ordered its nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, to leave the Baltic Sea and move toward the Mediterranean. NATO air and missile defense systems have shot down an Iranian ballistic missile over the eastern Mediterranean Sea. And the target of that missile was not immediately clear, which means Iran may have just fired a ballistic missile at a NATO member state. If you understand what that means under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, then you already know why tonight is the most dangerous night of this entire war so far. This is day 5 of Operation Epic Fury, and in 5 days, this conflict has transformed from a targeted U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran's nuclear and missile program into a regional war that is now pulling in NATO, France, Turkey, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and potentially every other major power that has a stake in the stability of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. The war is no longer contained. The war is spreading. And tonight, for the first time, it has touched European waters. Let us start with what France has done and why it matters so profoundly for the direction of this conflict. French President Emmanuel Macron appeared on national television on Tuesday evening and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through diplomatic and military circles across the entire Western world. He ordered the Charles de Gaulle, France's only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and the most powerful naval asset in the French military, to immediately leave its current position in the Baltic Sea and redeploy to the Mediterranean. The carrier will deploy with its full battle group, including frigates, its complete air wing of Rafale fighter jets, and supporting vessels. Macron also confirmed that Rafale fighter jets, air defense systems, and airborne radar assets have already been positioned in the region ahead of the carrier's arrival. And he added a statement that should make every person watching this video pay very close attention. He said France will continue this effort as much as necessary. As much as necessary. Those 4 words from the President of France, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, mean that France is no longer a spectator in this conflict. France is actively repositioning its most powerful military asset toward the theater of operations. France is deploying air defense systems. France is placing its fighter jets in range of the conflict zone. And Macron is saying France will do whatever is necessary for as long as necessary. That is not the language of a country that is watching from the sidelines. That is the language of a country that is preparing to be involved. And then came the development that made everything even more serious. Turkey confirmed that a ballistic missile fired by Iran was intercepted and destroyed by NATO air and missile defense systems in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The target of that missile was not immediately disclosed. But think about what that means. Iran fired a ballistic missile that traveled far enough to reach the eastern Mediterranean, which means it flew over or past multiple NATO member states, including Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, and potentially others. NATO systems had to intercept it. NATO military assets, the collective defense infrastructure of a 32-nation alliance that includes the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and most of Western Europe, were activated to shoot down an Iranian missile. This is not a theoretical escalation. This is an actual military engagement between Iran and NATO. And under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all of them. If that Iranian missile was targeting NATO territory or NATO assets, the legal and military implications are profound and potentially far-reaching beyond anything this conflict has produced so far. Macron also revealed something else in his televised address that has received far less attention than it deserves. He confirmed that French forces had already shot down Iranian drones earlier in the conflict while defending Allied airspace. Earlier in the conflict. before tonight's announcement, before the carrier deployment. France was already militarily engaged in this war, and the public was not informed until now. French military personnel were already intercepting Iranian projectiles in defense of Allied territory. That means France's involvement in this conflict is not new. It has been happening quietly under the radar, while Macron was publicly calling for diplomacy and restraint. Tonight's announcement did not mark France entering this war. Tonight's announcement marked France admitting it was already in this war. Now let us talk about what else happened today, because the NATO and France story, as significant as it is not the only major development on what has been the most consequential single day of this entire conflict. The death toll inside Iran has crossed 1,000 people. The Iranian Red Crescent and state media have confirmed 1,045 people killed in 5 days of U.S. and Israeli strikes across 153 cities and more than 500 locations throughout the country. And the Israeli military announced on Wednesday morning that it had launched what it called a broad wave of strikes in Tehran, targeting internal security command centers, missile launchers, and other military systems. This was the 10th wave of attacks against Iran since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. 10 waves of strikes in 5 days. The intensity of this campaign has been relentless, and it is showing no signs of slowing down. Tehran, Karaj, and Isfahan are all being struck simultaneously today. The holy city of Qom has also been targeted. Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting from inside Tehran described massive explosions heard across the capital. Buildings in central Tehran have been reduced to rubble. Iranian state television showed the destruction. And in one of the most alarming developments of the entire conflict, Russia's foreign ministry issued an official warning on Wednesday that Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant is now under direct threat from U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, with explosions reported just kilometers from the plant's perimeter. The Bushehr nuclear power plant is a civilian nuclear facility built with Russian assistance that contains a live nuclear reactor. If that reactor is struck and damaged, the consequences would not be limited to Iran. The radioactive fallout from a damaged nuclear reactor has no respect for national borders. Russia is warning the world that this war has now brought military operations to the edge of a civilian nuclear facility. That is a red line that most of the international community has never wanted to see crossed. Now let us talk about the development that has arguably generated more global outrage than any other single event since this war began. The strike on the girls' elementary school in the city of Manab. On Saturday, February 28th, the day Operation Epic Fury began, a strike hit an elementary school for girls in Manab in southeastern Iran. Iranian officials confirmed that over 160 students, most of them girls, and 14 teachers were killed in that single strike. Thousands of Iranians gathered on Tuesday and Wednesday for the funerals of the children. The images and videos emerging from those funerals have circulated around the world and have generated a wave of international condemnation that is putting enormous diplomatic pressure on the United States and Israel. Israel has flatly denied striking the school. The United States military said it is investigating the incident internally, but here is the reality. In a conflict where over 1,000 strikes have been conducted across 153 Iranian cities using more than 20 different weapon systems, the question of who struck what and when is genuinely complex. What is not complex is the human reality. Over 160 children are dead. Their funerals were attended by thousands of grieving Iranians. And the images of those funerals are being broadcast into living rooms and onto phone screens in every country on earth. The school strike is shaping the global narrative of this war in a way that no amount of military success can easily counter. and it is generating pressure from American allies, from European governments, and from international organizations that is adding another layer of political complexity to an already extraordinarily complicated situation. The United States Navy sank an Iranian warship today in the Indian Ocean. The Iranian Navy frigate Dena was reportedly struck and sunk by a United States Navy submarine approximately 40 nautical miles south of Gale, Sri Lanka. The Dena was a Mauj-class light frigate, one of Iran's domestically built naval vessels. It was returning from a multinational naval exercise in India when it was struck. The sinking of the Dena in the Indian Ocean represents a dramatic expansion of the geographic scope of this conflict. The fighting is no longer limited to the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. It has now reached the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers from Iran's coastline. The United States Navy is pursuing and sinking Iranian military vessels wherever they can be found. That is a significant escalation in the naval dimension of this war. On the political front inside the United States, the pressure on the Trump administration is intensifying by the hour. Democratic lawmakers emerging from a 3-hour briefing with Secretary of State Marco Rubio are openly sounding the alarm that the United States could be drawn into a prolonged ground war in Iran. U.S. senators used the word boots on the ground multiple times in describing their fears after the briefing. The U.S. Senate is now scheduled to vote on the War Powers Act in an attempt to test whether President Trump has the constitutional authority to continue waging these military operations without formal congressional authorization. Even if the resolution passes, Trump is almost certain to veto it. But the political and legal debate over the legitimacy of this war is intensifying inside Washington in a way that will have consequences for how long this operation can be sustained. Trump has also gotten into a public dispute with United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer that has exposed a significant crack in the transatlantic alliance. Trump criticized Starmer harshly, saying this is not Winston Churchill we are dealing with. The pointed remark came after Starmer refused to support the military operation against Iran or allow the United States to launch airstrikes from Diego Garcia, the joint UK-US military base in the Indian Ocean. The Diego Garcia base would have provided the United States with additional strike capacity against Iran from a completely different geographic direction. Starmer's refusal to authorize its use means that base, which the U.S. and U.K. have operated jointly for decades, is effectively off-limits for this conflict. That is a meaningful constraint on American operational flexibility, and it represents the most public and significant disagreement between Washington and London on a military matter in many years. In Lebanon, the situation continues to deteriorate rapidly. Israel's ground forces have pushed deeper into the south of the country. Israeli airstrikes are hitting targets across Beirut's southern suburbs and the Bqa Valley simultaneously. The Lebanese government has taken the extraordinary step of officially banning Hezbollah's military activities and demanding the group hand over its weapons to the Lebanese state. That demand is almost certainly unenforceable, given that Hezbollah's military wing is far stronger than the Lebanese army. But the fact that the Lebanese government felt compelled to make that demand publicly suggests the intense international and domestic pressure it is operating under as Israeli ground forces advance into its territory. Qatar arrested 10 suspected spies today who were reportedly operating on behalf of the IRGC inside the country. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East. Finding that Iran had placed a network of 10 intelligence operatives inside Qatar at the same time as Iran was launching ballistic missile strikes against Al Udeid tells you everything you need to know about how sophisticated and comprehensive Iran's intelligence and military planning for this conflict actually was. This was not improvised. This was prepared. Iran knew this war was coming, and it prepared accordingly. The United States has now closed its embassies in Kuwait, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. American diplomatic personnel across the region are sheltering in place or being evacuated. The State Department confirmed that 9,000 Americans have left the Middle East in the past 72 hours, with thousands more requesting assistance. Rubio acknowledged that some evacuation flights have had to turn back midway because airspace over the region was abruptly closed due to ongoing strikes. Americans are stranded in a war zone that their own government helped create, and the evacuation operation is struggling to keep pace with the deteriorating security situation. And through all of this, through the carrier deployments and the Nato missile intercepts and the sunken warships and the dead children and the burning embassies and the closed airspace and the rising oil prices and the falling stock markets, the fundamental question that nobody in Washington or Jerusalem or Tehran has answered remains exactly where it was on day one. What does the end of this war actually look like? Trump says the United States will easily prevail. Rubio says the hardest hits are yet to come. The Pentagon is telling Congress the war could expand to include ground troops. Iran is firing missiles into the Mediterranean and activating its intelligence networks across the Gulf. France is sending its aircraft carrier. NATO has already shot down an Iranian missile. Russia is warning about the nuclear plant at Bushehr. And 1,000 people inside Iran are already dead. This war began 5 days ago. And in 5 days, it has gone from a targeted strike campaign to a conflict that has pulled in NATO, France, Turkey, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, and now potentially every country in the Eastern Mediterranean. The question is not whether this war will end. The question is whether anyone involved in starting it actually has a credible and realistic plan for how to end it before it becomes something even larger and even more dangerous than what it already is. We will be here every single evening covering every development as this historic and deeply dangerous moment continues to unfold. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now because in a conflict moving this fast, you cannot afford to miss a single update. Now we want to hear from you directly. A. With France deploying its aircraft carrier and NATO already shooting down Iranian missiles over the Mediterranean, do you believe this war is now on the verge of becoming a full-scale NATO versus Iran conflict that could drag the entire Western alliance into a Middle East war none of them voted for? B. The Iranian missile fired toward the Mediterranean had an unknown target. If that missile was aimed at a NATO member state's territory or military assets, do you think NATO's Article 5 Collective Defense Clause will be formally invoked? And what happens to this conflict if it is? C. With Russia warning about the Bushehr nuclear power plant being within range of U.S.-Israeli strikes, do you think Moscow will move from issuing warnings to taking direct action to protect a nuclear facility it helped build? And if so, what does Russian military involvement in this conflict look like? Drop your answer in the comments right now. We read every single one, and on a night like tonight, your perspective on where this is heading matters enormously.